Hello, I'm Kevin. This is my wife Brittany, and we're going to be reading from the MacArthur Daily Bible, the July 14th message, and we're going to read it. And the only way to read it is verse by verse and word by word, and we don't add or take away or change anything, paraphrase anything. It's just exactly how Pastor MacArthur has written it is exactly how we're reading it, and we're just reading it. So um, we are in Second Chronicles in the Old Testament, and we'll get started.
Our versions for today are 2 Chronicles 23:1 through 24:27. Now the 7th year Jehoiada strengthened himself and took captains of hundreds, Azariah the son of Jeroham, Ishmael the son of Johanan, Azariah the son of Obed, Messiah the son of Adiah, and Elisaphat the son of Zichri. And they entered the covenant with him. They went through Judah and gathered the Levites from the cities of Judah and the heads of their fathers' households in Israel. And they came to Jerusalem. Then all the assembly made a covenant with the king in the house of God, and Jehoiada said to them, Behold, the king's son shall reign, as the Lord has spoken concerning the sons of David. This is the thing which you shall do. 1/3 of you, of the priests, of the Levites who come in the Sabbath, shall be gatekeepers. 1/3 shall be at the king's house, and the third at the gate of the foundation. And all the people shall be in the courts of the house of the Lord. But let no one enter the house of the Lord except the priests and the ministering Levites. They may enter, for they are holy, and let all the people keep the charge of the Lord. The Levites will surround the king, each man with his weapons in his hand, and whoever enters the house, let him be killed. Thus be the king when he comes in and when he goes out. And now our first notes from verse 3. As the Lord has spoken. This is one of the most dramatic moments in Messianic history. The human offspring of David had been reduced to one, Joash. If he had died, there would have been no human heir to the Davidic throne, and it would have meant the destruction of the line of the Messiah. However, God remedied the situation by providentially protecting Joash. This is in 22:10 through 12, and eliminating Athaliah. That's 23:12 through 21. Now we're back in verse 8. So the Levites and all Judah did according to all that Jehoiada and the priests had commanded, and each one of them took his men there to come on the Sabbath with those who were to go out on the Sabbath, for Jehoiada the priest did not dismiss any of the divisions. Then Jehoiada the priest gave to the captains of hundreds the spears and the large and small shields which had been King David's, which were in the house of God. He stationed all the people, each man with his weapon in his hand, and from his right side of the house to the left side of the house by the altar, and by the house around the king. Then they brought out the king's son, and put the crown on him, and gave him the testimony, and made him king. And Jehoiada and his sons anointed him, and said, Long live the king. And when Athaliah heard the noise, and the people running and praising the king, she came to the house of the Lord and the people. She looked, and behold, the king was standing by the pillar at the entrance, and the captains and the trumpeters were beside the king. And all the people of the land rejoiced and blew trumpets, and the singers and their musical instruments, leading the praise. Then Athaliah tore her clothes and said, Treason, treason. Jehoiada the priest brought out the captains of the hundreds who were appointing the army, and said, Bring her out between the ranks, and whoever follows her put to death with the sword. For the priest said, Let her not be put to death in the house of the Lord. So they seized her, and when she arrived at the entrance of the horse gate in the king's house, they put her to death there. Then Jehoiada made a covenant between himself and the people and the king, and that they would be the Lord's people. And all the people went to the house of Baal and tore it down, and they broke it in pieces, his altars and his images, killed Mattan the priest of Baal before the altars. Moreover, Jehoiada placed officers of the house of the Lord under the authority of the Levitical priests, whom David had assigned over the house of the Lord, to offer the burnt offerings of the Lord, as it is written in the law of Moses, with rejoicing and singing according to the order of David. He stationed the gatekeepers of the house of the Lord so that no one would enter who was in any way unclean. He took the captains of hundreds, the nobles, the rulers, and the people of all the people of the land, and brought the king down from the house of the Lord, and came through the upper gate to the king's house. And they placed the king upon the royal throne. So all the people of the land rejoiced, and the city was quiet, for they had put Athaliah to death with the sword. Joash was 7 years old when he became king, and he reigned 40 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Zebiah from Beersheba. Joash did what was right in the sight of the Lord all the days of Jehoiada the priest. Jehoiada took two wives for him, and he became the father of sons and daughters. Now it came about after this that Joash decided to restore the house of the Lord. He gathered the priests and the Levites and said to them, "Go out to the cities of Judah and collect money from all Israel to repair the house of your God annually, and you shall do the matter quickly." But the Levites did not act quickly. So the king summoned Jehoiada the chief priest and said to him, "Why have you not required the Levites to bring it from Judah and from Jerusalem the levy fixed by Moses, the servants of the Lord, and the congregation of Israel for the tent of the testimony?" For the sons of the wicked Athaliah had broken into the house of God and even used the holy things in the house of the Lord for Baals. So the king commanded that they made a chest and set it outside the gate of the house of the Lord. They made a proclamation in Judah and Jerusalem to bring to the Lord the levy fixed by Moses, the servant of God of Israel, in the wilderness. All the officers and the people rejoiced and brought their levels and dropped them to the chest until they had finished. It came about whenever the chest was brought in the king's officers by the Levites, and when they saw it, there was much money. Then the king's scribe and the chief priest officer would come empty the chest, take it, and return it to its place. Thus they did daily and collected much money. The king and Jehoiada gave it to those who did the work of the service of the house of the Lord. And they hired masons and carpenters to restore the house of the Lord, and also workers in iron and bronze to repair the house of the Lord. So the workmen labored, and the repair work progressed in their hands, and they restored the house of God according to its specifications and strengthened it. When they had finished, they brought out the rest of the money before the king and Jehoiada, and it was made into utensils for the house of the Lord. Utensils for the service and burnt offering, and pans and utensils of gold and silver, and they offered burnt offerings in the house of the Lord continually all the days of Jehoiada. Now when Jehoiada reached a ripe old age, he died. He was 130 years old at his death. They buried him in the city of David among the kings because he had done well in Israel and to God in his house. And now our note is for 15 through 16. Jehoiada. This man was the high priest of Athaliah's and Joash's reign. That's in 2 Chronicles 23, 1 through 24:16. Who championed God's cause of righteousness during the days of evil by 1. Leading the fight against the idols, 2. Permitting the coup against Athaliah, and 3. Granting the throne to Joash and bringing the subsequent revival. And now we have verse 17. But after the death of Jehoiada, the officials of Judah came and bowed down to the king, and the king listened to them. They abandoned the house of the Lord, the God of their fathers, and served Asherim and the idols. So wrath came upon Judah and Jerusalem for their guilt. Yet he sent the prophets to teach them to bring back the Lord. Though they testified against them, they would not listen. Then the Spirit of God came to Zechariah the son of Jehoiada the priest, and he stood above the people and said to them, "Thus has said, why do you transgress the commandments of the Lord and do not prosper? Because you have forsaken the Lord, he has also forsaken you." So they conspired against him in the command of the king, and they stoned him to death in the court of the house of the Lord. Thus Joash the king did not remember the kindness which his father Jehoiada had shown him, but murdered his son. And he died and said, "May the Lord see and avenge." Now it happened at the turn of the year. And now we're in verse 25. When they had departed from him, for they left him very sick, his own servants conspired against him because of the blood of the sons of Jehoiada the priest, and murdered him on his bed. So he died, and they buried him in the city of David, but they did not bury him in the tombs of the kings. Now these are those who conspired against him: Zabad, son of Shimith, of the Ammonites; Jehozabad, the son of Shimrith, of the Moabites. As to his sons and the many oracles against him in the rebuilding of the house of God, behold, they are written in the treaties of the book of the kings. Then Amizah the son became king in his place. And now we have Psalm 83, verses 9 through 18. Deal with them as in with Midian, as with Sisera and Jabin at the torrent of the Kishon, who were destroyed at Endor, who became as dung for the grounds. Make their nobles like Oreb and Zeb, and all their princes like Zebah and Zilunah. who said, "Let us possess for ourselves the pastures of God." O my God, make them like the whirling dust, like chaff before the wind, like fire that burns the forest, and like flame that sets the mountains on fire. So pursue them with your temptress and terrify them with your storm. Fill their faces with dishonor, that they may seek your name, O Lord. Let them be ashamed and dismayed forever, and let them be humiliated and perish, that they may know that you alone, whose name is the Lord, are most high over all the earth. And now we have our note for Psalms, which is 83:18. Know and most high. The purpose of the militations against the hostile nations is neither personal nor national, but spiritual, that the nations may know and glorify God. You alone, the Lord. The Gentile nations need to know that the God of the Bible is the only God. And now we have Proverbs 21, verse 2 through 3. Every man's way is right in his own eyes, but the Lord weighs the hearts to do righteousness and justice. It is desired by the Lord more than sacrifice. And now we have Acts 18, verse 1 through 28. After these things, he left Athens and went to Corinth and found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, having recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. He came to them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them, and they were working, for by trade they were tent makers. And he was reasoning in the synagogue every Sabbath and trying to persuade the Jews and the Greeks. Our first note is from verse 1, which is Corinth, the leading political and commercial center in Greece. It was located at the strategic point of the Isthmus of Corinth, which is connected to the Peloponnesian Peninsula with the rest of Greece. Virtually all traffic between northern and southern Greece had to pass through the city. Because Corinth was a trade center and a host to all sorts of travelers, it had unsettled population that was extremely debauched. It also housed the temple of Aphrodite, the goddess of love. 1,000 temple priestesses who were ritual prostitutes came each evening into the city to practice their trade.
Junior. Scott.
And now we're back in verse 5. But when Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, Paul began devoting himself completely to the word, solemnly testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. But when they resisted and blasphemed, he shook out his garments and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I am clean. From now on I will go to the Gentiles." Then he left there and went to the house of a man named Titus Justus, a worshiper of God, whose house was next to the synagogue. Crispus, the leader of the synagogue, believed in the Lord with all his household, and many of the Corinthians, when he heard, were believing and being baptized. And the Lord said to Paul in the night by a vision, "Do not be afraid any longer, but go on speaking and do not be silent, for I am with you, and no man will attack you in order to harm you, for I have many people in this city." And he settled there 1 year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. But while Gallio was a consul of Achaia, the Jews with one accord rose up against Paul and brought him before the judgment seat, saying, "This man persuaded men to worship God contrary to the law." But when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, "If it were a matter of wrong or vicious crime, O Jews, it would be reasonable for me to put up with you. But if there are any questions about words and names in your own law, look after it yourselves. I am unwilling to be a judge of these matters." And he drove them away from the judgment seat. And they all took out hold of Sosthenes, a leader of the synagogue, and began beating him in front of the judgment seat. But Gallio was not concerned about any of these things. Now we have two notes. One's from verse 8, which is Crispus, the leader of the synagogue. The conversion of this respected leader must have sent a shockwave through the Jewish community. And now we have verse 13, which is a contrary to the law. While Judaism was not an official religion, it was officially tolerated in the Roman world, and Christianity was viewed as a sect of Judaism. The Jews in Corinth claimed that Paul's teaching was external to Judaism and therefore should be banned. Had Gallio ruled in the Jews' favor, Christianity could have been outlawed throughout the empire. And now we're in verse 18. Paul, having remained many days longer, took leave of the brethren and put out to sea for Syria, with him Priscilla and Aquila. In Cenchrea he had his hair cut, for he was keeping a vow. They came to Ephesus, and he left them there. Now he himself entered the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. When they asked him to stay for a longer time, he did not consent, but taking leave of them, saying, I will return to you again if God wills, he set sail from Ephesus. When he had landed in Caesarea, he went up and greeted the church and went down to Antioch, and having spent time there, he left and passed successfully through the Galatian region and Phrygia, strengthening all his disciples. Now a Jew named Apollos, an Alexandrian by birth, an eloquent man, came from Ephesus. He was a mighty in the scripture. This man had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and being fervent in the Spirit, he was speaking and teaching accurately the things concerning Jesus, being acquainted only with the baptism of John. And he began to speak out boldly in the synagogue. But when Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they took him aside and explained to him the way of God more accurately. And when he wanted to go across Acacia, the brethren encouraged him and wrote to the disciples to welcome him. And when he had arrived, he greatly helped those who had believed through grace. For he powerfully refuted the Jews in public, demonstrated by scriptures that Jesus was the Christ. And now we have our day 14 notes, which is how did Aquila and Priscilla help Apollos? In Acts 18:24, Apollos came to Ephesus and clearly was an Old Testament saint and follower of John the Baptist in verse 25. He came from Alexandria, an important city in Egypt, located near the mouth of the Nile. In the first century, it had a large Jewish population. Thus, Apollos, though born outside of Israel, was reared in Jewish cultural setting. It states that he was mighty in the scriptures, referring to Apollos' knowledge of the Old Testament scriptures. That knowledge, combined with his eloquence, allowed him to crush his Jewish opponents in later debates, in verse 28. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord, in verse 25. This did not include the Christian faith, in verse 26. The Old Testament uses the phrase to describe the spiritual and moral standards God required his people to observe, being acquainted only with the baptism of John. Despite his knowledge of the Old Testament, Apollos did not fully understand Christian truth. John's baptism was to prepare Israel for the Messiah's arrival. Apollos accepted that message, even acknowledging that Jesus of Nazareth was Israel's Messiah. He did not, however, understand such basic Christian truths as the significance of Christ's death and resurrection, the ministry of the Holy Spirit, and the church as God's new witness for people. He was a redeemed Old Testament believer in verse 24. Fortunately, Aquila and Priscilla completed Apollos' training in divine truth by instructing him in fullness of Christian faith in verse 26. After further instruction, he became a powerful Christian preacher, and his ministry profoundly influenced the Corinthians, as referenced in 1 Corinthians 1:12. Aquila and Priscilla were a husband and wife team who became Paul's close friends and even risked their lives for him. That's referenced in Romans 16:3-4. And that is all of our notes for today.
Thanks for joining us and watching, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you.